So thank you so much, Route 50, for hosting this conversation, and thank you all for being here. We're going to share our perspective on innovation in procurement and some of the work that we've been doing in that space. So we're here today to dive deeper into one approach on procurement. It's called challenge-based procurement, and you'll learn more about it. There's obviously a lot of different approaches to procurement in government. Anne shared an approach that she's using in Santa Clara County, but this is something that we're really proud of and we think has the ability to make big impact. We also want you to take away 3 things from this conversation that we're having today. 1 is really understanding more about this approach that we're going to be sharing. 2 is really approaches and ideas of how to make change in your own organization around procurement. And 3rd, hopefully like-minded people who are passionate about procurement in the audience here today. So just a little bit of the agenda here. So we're going to be going into, procurement and why it's so difficult for buying government technology. We'll jump into a little bit of a activity, as well as jumping into a detailed understanding of challenge-based procurement and a case study, as well as a Q&A.
My name is Katie Podbilski. I work with Jay at City Innovate. My role is the Startup and Residence Program Manager. I've been working on our program, which employs a challenge-based procurement methodology for about 2.5 years.
Thank you, Katie. And so my background, I am the co-executive director at City Innovate. It's a role I've been in for a little bit over a year. And our organization works with governments all across the US, some of them here in the audience. We work with San Jose, we work with San Francisco. So we work with a number of governments. And our approach is really helping them address the challenges they're facing by thoughtfully integrating and implementing emerging technologies. We do that through a very structured program, Startup and Residence, which we'll share. Prior to this, I was the Chief Innovation Officer for the Mayor of San Francisco. I was first appointed in 2012, served for over 6 years, and served in public service for over 12 years in San Francisco. And during that time, obviously being sort of the center of technology and innovation globally, we had so much opportunity to work with the wealth of talent here in the Bay Area and nationally. And we asked ourselves, how do we actually tap into that to help transform the services that we're delivering? And how do we do this in a very thoughtful way? And that was the start of our journey in thinking about procurement, knowing that this is a really important touch point, and can we innovate around procurement to actually enable that to be a force multiplier? So why specifically is government technology purchasing so difficult and painful? So very specifically, if you look at the way that it's happening today, you're really looking at the specifics on putting together these detailed requirements. You're putting together this long, structured process that can take months or years. And this is not something I'm proud of, but it took 4 years to get through an RFP in San Francisco for one purchase. And so, how do you do that? And the challenges with this complex, long process is the fact that it's not a level playing field, right? It's tilted towards organizations that have the resources and capabilities of navigating that labyrinth. And so when we talk about how do you have more and be more inclusive in the procurement process, set-asides and preferences are one way to think about that. But I would argue that if we actually rethink how we approach procurement so it's less bureaucratic, but still preserving the important values and principles of procurement, that we can achieve those same outcomes. So we're going to start off with your experiences around procurement and the pain points that you have in this issue. And so we want to spend a little bit of time, if you all could spend maybe a couple minutes around the table talking about your experience with procurement. What are the specific issues that you've seen? Maybe it's a lack of buy-in, maybe it's a lack of understanding of the data implications downstream, or the fact that procurement is never addressed until the end of the project. So spend 2 minutes, and then we're going to pick on a few different tables to report out on the discussion that you've had. So get started.
ask everyone to wrap up their conversations, finish their thoughts, and we'll all come back as a group and hear what some of the tables talked about.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick on some folks here. That table over there, that's continuing the conversation. I'm sure there's some really good discussions happening there. So I'm going to ask you to report out your discussion.
Okay. So some of the things we talked about were the fact that if you're doing a pilot or an alpha, a lot of procurement departments will then have you be ineligible for the full project following on, and how difficult that is if you're starting work with an organization and then not able to continue it because you've now made yourself ineligible. We also talked about the frustrations of online, the lack of online RFP submissions. So the complication of having to submit something that is 10 copies that have all been, one original and 9 copies, and they're all 100 pages and they're bound, and how ridiculous that is, that like 20% of local government actually allows for digital submission and the other 80% is all physical. We also talked about some of the disconnect between what happens when you have a team that is, or department level, that's done an evaluation process based on their needs, and then it goes to procurement and legal that have a different set of expectations, and how that disconnect sometimes really can derail projects. So.
That's great, thank you. 20% online only. Wow, I didn't realize that. And we've heard earlier from Anne the issue with pilots where you can learn a lot, but then it can preclude vendors from actually participating downstream. So I think that's a really important piece. I'm going to pick on Jane from San Francisco. I know she's been doing some deep thinking about procurement. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Here you go. Thank you. We talked about how we brought up a good point about like pre-RFP market research. He brought up, thank you. He brought up a really great point that in Florida there was a department that was trying to procure something that's very new and innovative, and they were hesitant to talk, or the vendors themselves were hesitant to talk to them because just by talking with these potential bidders, they might be sort of like out of the running, it would be seen as like favoritism, just even to having that conversation. So they weren't able to do enough market research before even writing the RFP, and how that limits the conversations that's really needed before RFP. And we talked earlier about like the importance of user research and going out there and talking with people, so they weren't able to do that. I think in my own experience as well, like Jay mentioned, I help lead the STIR program, or Startup and Resident program in San Francisco, and there's definitely been a lot of pain points along the way, time being one of them. Just being, the challenge-based procurement itself too, I thought that was a really good approach to innovative procurement. It's just because it's a combination of RFI and RFP, so I think it's like sort of like the best of both worlds. So we had a really good conversation.
Thank you. And I know you had some further point to add? No? She did.
I think an RFI, it's time-consuming, but an RFI is a great tool by which to do your research.
Sure.
Formally, get that user feedback and all of that, and not have to worry about people responding, we disqualify, we need one more.
It's a good point. And I think it shows sort of the importance of collaboration with procurement office that can advise you on different mechanisms, formal mechanisms.
Hi there, I'm a vendor, so I'll just self-identify. One of the bigger challenges in the RFI process, I want to touch on this, has to do with the fact that you can invest tremendous resources and you never hear anything. Years later roll by and you're curious, okay, so what happened with that information? So County of San Diego has a public-private partnership group that actually gets vendors to talk with City and County of San Diego in particular, and it gives you the opportunity on an informal basis to discuss some of these things, not necessarily to influence, but to educate. And so I'd like to see more of that take place within public procurement. The other situation we talked about here at our table was identified sometimes as just a matter of who's ever the cheapest. And so I'd identify one of the problems is that as a vendor, I've had to go back and clean up somebody else's implementation of my own tech. And because it was lowest bidder, that the integrator did not actually know what they were doing, and we had to spend tremendous resources to fix the problem for the customer. So just a couple things I'd like to touch on.
Yeah, and I've heard that about sort of RFI fatigue, and how do you rethink that? And I think that's really important. If you think about the procurement process, it's such a sort of stilted process. It's very transactional and it's very regulated that you actually can't have a conversation. It's very difficult to have that conversation. Well, thank you so much for thinking about those challenges and issues that you've seen in your experience. So we're going to share a little bit more about challenge-based procurement and what that is. So if you look at challenge-based procurement, it's a different way of thinking about procurement. So if you think about traditional procurement, you're very focused on a solution, and you have all these detailed requirements and specifications. Those specifications can be dozens, if not hundreds of pages. So say you're buying CRM or whatever technology, you're going to go and do market research, maybe copy a white paper that a vendor sent to you and regurgitate that as a set of requirements. But it's going to be, you're trying to control this process by having very detailed requirements. The approach of challenge-based procurement is really focused on what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve and what is the problem that you have. And by taking that small shift in the RFP process, you're doing a few things. One is that you're really unlocking innovation, because you can have folks coming to the table with creative approaches to reaching that outcome. You're not dictating exactly how you want to get that problem solved. Second is by having this approach of focusing on outcome, it actually streamlines the approach. It's more inclusive that way because it's a much more brief document, and you're allowing people to come to the table who may not have participated in a more traditional procurement. And so there's a number of benefits to it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the process itself is within the traditional RFP process. So the RFP template that you often have in your organization, you're going to use that, but instead of the highly specific requirements, you're going to use this, what we call a challenge statement. We have it very well structured, but it's about a page or 2 pages long, and that's it. The rest is boilerplate, sort of RFP language. The other piece of this, when you go through the solicitation process, is that you're not asking for this big, lengthy PDF proposal, a 1,000-page proposal. You actually have very specific questions, and they're responding to those questions. So we've seen an order of magnitude efficiency gain. So we've seen it on the vendor side dropping from weeks or months of effort to put an RFP response together, dropping to an hour or 2 hours to respond to an RFP. And on the government side, instead of taking months or years, in my case, it drops that process down to weeks or days even. And so, again, there's a lot of benefits by doing this approach. The other piece is the selection is done on 2 things. It's based on the proposal that you're getting back, but also on evidence. You're evaluating the actual solution. So let's say you have 10 respondents to your challenge-based RFP. You're going to down select to maybe 1 based on the response, based on the credibility of the team, the approach that they're going to use to solve that outcome, and cost as well. You can factor that in. Once you down select, you can now actually either do an award or actually do a demonstration period of what we suggest is 4 months, where you're actually trying the solution out and testing out, can they actually meet the outcome that they stated earlier on. And that period of 4 months is a very collaborative period. It's not just go forth and do something. It's actually sharing data, it's sharing sort of process flows, maybe access to public right-of-way, et cetera. And so by the end of the 4 months, you have quantitative and qualitative data whether or not you should be continuing to work with that vendor. And that's something we do every day in our personal lives. You think about whether you buy a car, you don't look at just a guidebook, a proposal from the website. You drive it, obviously. Your home or wherever you're renting or buying, you try those things out. But when it comes to government procurement, especially around technology, we don't have that affordance. we're just relying on these big PDF documents that I don't think the vendors really appreciate putting together, or the government staff. You're not getting meaningful information from that sort of traditional approach. I think we've got some benefits here. So again, lower barrier to entry, because it only takes an hour or 2 hours long to respond to that RFP, you're getting a much broader set of folks who are coming to the table. Often people from underrepresented communities, people of color, women, veterans who are now able to participate without set-asides. And because you have less documentation, again, it's more streamlined. You're not worrying like, are you over-constraining because of the requirements, under-constrained, et cetera. And you have this collaborative process and, of course, evidence. So you're really lowering risk, essentially, when you're going through this process. And ultimately, you're going to hopefully get fewer change orders and schedule changes because they've done some pre-implementation already. During that 4 months, they've done that implementation, some portion of it. So we're going to share with you an example, a little bit of a case study of challenge-based procurement at scale. I helped create this in San Francisco. It's evolved a little bit in San Francisco. There's been some changes, but we are working with nearly 30 governments across the US and in Canada, both at the local, regional, and state level on this approach. And so we'll share some examples. Katie's going to run through that.
Thanks, Jay. So we've talked a little bit throughout this presentation about Startup in Residence, and just to quickly define what it is, it's really a national program in which governments join a community of other governments that are coming together and exploring the potential for emerging technologies to address problems, deliver better tools to government staff, and deliver better services to constituents. And really the kind of driving force or the methodology behind the STIR program really is challenge-based procurement. So kind of the process that governments in STIR go through is they join, and over a process of 10 months, they identify problems that either the public or their staff have expressed interest in solving. They define and just describe what those problems are and what the outcomes should look like. They share those problems and those intentions to solve those problems publicly, and we help invite entrepreneurs, researchers, small businesses, startups to work together with the governments and either build something from scratch or customize an existing solution to meet the different governments' needs. And the governments have the authority to review all of those proposals and make a decision based on who they want to work with over a period of 4 months. And during that 4-month period, the startups and the governments are working very closely together, getting to know each other, exchanging what their respective cultures are like in their organizations and how they both manage projects. I think something that's really cool about the program is just that cultural exchange and that learning exchange of different ways to work, different ways to solve problems, different ways to be efficient. And some of the benefits that kind of come from this program is at the end of the process, there's the potential for a new solution to be ready to be implemented, and that problem to begin being addressed. There's also the acceleration of growth of these mostly young companies. As Jay mentioned, the procurement process itself is streamlined. So sometimes some of these process improvement projects, or especially projects that are exploring new and emerging technologies, can take very long periods of time. And this all happens over a course of about 10 months. And lastly, fostering culture change. And so kind of where we're at today with the program is we've been working with 28 governments across the US and Canada who have been kind of experimenting with this procurement model and seeing the potential for emerging technologies and just a shift in the procurement process to help solve problems and deliver better services. Over 1,000 startups have applied to join the program. 86 startups have been selected and have worked on projects over the program's history. And 73% of the projects do result in contracts. And we kind of equate that to 73% of the problems that are surfaced through the program are really addressed as a result of getting a contract. And something else that's beneficial about the program, so that remaining percent of the projects that don't go to contract, there is an immense amount of learnings that happen from those projects. And I think both of the governments and the startups who participate, that where those projects don't result in a contract, there's still benefits that both sides see as a result of working together over 4 months, figuring out product features that are helpful and not helpful, and just what are some really root causes of different problems and the best ways to address them. Jay was also talking a little bit earlier about how challenge-based procurement lowers barriers for different types of organizations and people to work with government. And so 53% of founders of startups who have participated in the program are women, people of color, or members of the LGBTQ community. Over $200 million has been raised by the startup companies after graduating from the program. And I think the last number there is 3 startups have been acquired as well. Something really interesting happened that we kind of weren't expecting earlier this year. So Governor Gavin Newsom released an executive order his first day in office, speaking directly to kind of the methodology and logic behind challenge-based procurement, which is essentially solving problems is going to require collaboration across industries and sectors, and it's going to require working together. And if we can shift the traditional way that government purchases things, but still keep intact some of those values that the traditional procurement process tries to hold up, we think that there's a way for problems to be solved and better services to be provided. Okay. And we had a couple of examples that we wanted to go through, specifically projects that the departments in the city and county of San Francisco have pursued. I think we're going to just do one for the sake of time, and the one that we want to show you is a video. So I'm going to ask the AV team to help me get that playing.
So at Family and Children's Services, at the Human Services Agency, we intervene in cases of child maltreatment, child abuse and neglect. And sometimes because of safety issues, we do need to place kids into another home, at least temporarily, to make sure that they're safe and well cared for. We have a problem in that we have a critical shortage of foster homes, especially in San Francisco and very close to San Francisco. And it's also a very complicated process to get homes approved. So our staff was going out and doing a lot of work and working hard and trying to get this very complicated process done, and then coming back to the office and recording it into a spreadsheet. So we didn't really have the tools that needed to. It was like a 70-column spreadsheet. It was really hard to keep track of all the data. so then we couldn't keep track of getting homes approved, and our staff were frustrated with this, and also the care providers didn't know where they stood in the process.
I co-founded Binti a few years ago because my sister went through the adoption process, and it's a really difficult, complicated process. And I come from a software background, and I thought of ideas on how great software could improve the adoption process. So we built TurboTax for being approved to adopt, and we now do that in 30 states with private adoption agencies. Then a couple years ago, I began volunteering with foster children in San Francisco as a court-appointed special advocate. And through that experience, I became really interested in getting involved in foster care.
Hey, Felicia, how's it going? Good, how about you? Good.
The problem was we didn't really know how to get started. We'd never worked in government before. Do you just kind of cold email someone in government and ask them that you want to help? So right around this time, as we were thinking about how to get started, one of my friends heard about the Startup in Residence program and forwarded me information about it. And it turns out they had a project proposed by the foster care team that they were looking for help with a software project. We applied for it and got it, and it was a perfect way for us to get involved in government for the first time because it was a 4-month pilot. Our team shadowed their team and understood their processes and challenges and built something really collaboratively with them. We built 3 products for Human Services Agency. The first is a public website where people in the community can learn about fostering a child, adopting a child from foster care, getting all of their questions answered, and they can reach out to the team to learn more. The second is TurboTax for becoming a foster parent. We're replacing physical paperwork with online forms, e-signing. We're trying to make it as user-friendly as possible for people to get through the application. The third product is software for the social workers that are in charge of approving foster parents. So we let them see at a glance all the applicants in the process. We let them do background checks, mark trainings as complete, do the paperwork they need to do, and we pull reports for supervisors. Overall, the social workers estimated that our software saves them 20 to 40% of their time. After doing the pilot with San Francisco through the Startup in Residence program, they served as a reference customer as we began reaching out to other counties. And over the last 6 months, we now have 19 counties working with Binti for our foster care software. Looking back at the whole process, we're incredibly grateful to the Startup in Residence program because it was a great way for Binti to get a chance to work with government for the first time. We also loved working with Human Services Agency. Everyone there is smart, passionate, and really fun to work with, and we hope to work with them for a long time.
I think in the interest of time, also a little notice here for any governments here that are interested, we're starting our next cohort, so we have applications due at the end of the month. We want to close by jumping into QA, but one thing I want to note on that example is that in 4 months they built 3 products, and this was something that the Human Services Agency was able to test out and really understand, is this something we should spend money on? And not only that, but they got a big discount on the software for, if you're the 2nd or 10th customer, you're gonna pay a lot more because Binti recognized that there's a lot of value in that 4 months, a lot of data, a lot of insights that they gathered, so they spent a lot less than they normally would. And we're seeing that across all of our governments. So with that, we're gonna open it up to questions in the audience, if anyone has any thoughts or reflections on challenge-based procurement.
For the mic. You described the initial award as a result of a down select. Is the idea that the initial 4 months is like the base requirement and then you have an option to keep going? Or how do you position yourself to, hey, I really like this, this demonstrates value, this is getting us where we're going. How do you keep the relationship going?
Yeah, so you can do once you do the down select, you can do an award at the end of that down select, or you can do the award at the end of the demonstration period. And so if you're doing it at the latter period, you're gonna incorporate in the RFP the actual success metrics that you're looking for. So we're seeing governments do both ways, and we're learning to see which one's better. And if you need more than 4 months, you agree on the terms. What's interesting, those 4 months are unpaid, so it's a voluntary period of time, so they're contributing hundreds of thousands of dollars of effort and time during those 4 months. So no money's exchanged. Now, if you're doing a much bigger project, let's say a team of 10 people is coming in and it's a big software implementation, you may need to put a stipend or a fee for that time period, or you might down select to 3 candidates and do a bake-off. So you can do a number of permutations on this, but that demonstration period is a really key part, and it's something that you want to sort of reflect reality and create a war room, if you will, and make sure that the vendor is able to really meet your needs.
Having reviewed requests for contracts that originated from this program, one of the challenges that we have at OCA is the fact that the RFP, and I'm referring to primarily the one that was done in 2017 and 18, it uses the word pilot, and it treats it as a pilot, which triggers its own set of requirements under our admin code. So Alaric de Graffenried, I don't know if you've been working closely with him. I have asked him to highly recommend in your next iteration to not use that word, to instead treat this more as a phase approach. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1, we explore, information gathering. Phase 2, we test. Phase 3, we implement. If you take that approach up front, you make it a lot easier for when these things come to us in the end. Because one of the issues we're having is we have some departments, I think the garbage can one, for example, that you showed a slide of, they're testing it, they love the product, but it's a pilot. So they now want to say, oh, but it's a sole source. You know, we tested it. This is the only product that can do what we want. Of course it is, because they built it for you. So of course it's the only product. But you can't use the sole source argument at that point. You've opted yourself out of that because this was a pilot. Had it been a phase approach, all of that could have been avoided. It's just a logistical technicality, but it's a really big one.
It's an important one, and I think that's why collaboration is really important up front. So all of our governments that we work with, we bring in their chief procurement officer and the whole team to make sure that it meets their needs, and I know San Francisco has a very specific legislation on pilots. So that should be defined up front. Everyone's a little bit different, but this process works at scale. The state of California is doing it with projects over $100 million. The federal government has used this approach as well, DOD. So this approach is battle tested and proven. Now you're gonna have to tweak it and contextualize it and make sure it works, but that collaboration is really important. Well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to share our work, and I know many of you are headed off to lunch, so we won't stand in your way.